It would be fun to ask everybody who's watching this what their favorite place they've ever been is, or what the most beautiful place they've ever been is. For me, probably Santorini would fall into one of those categories. Just spectacularly beautiful. We lived in the Andes Mountains of Peru for a while, and again, just spectacularly beautiful. Every year we go on a hike, and I remember this spot in particular, just stopping and just sitting there and looking at it because it was so spectacularly beautiful. As we come to this point in our study of the story of Scripture, we come to a place where we just have to stop and look at the beauty of God. If you're joining us for the first time, we've been walking through Scripture in this series called The Story, and we began, of course, with creation in Genesis chapter 1. We've moved through the story and looked at the God who doesn't wipe out these people who rebel against him. Instead, he makes covenants and promises, builds agreements with them. As the story continued, we saw that God gave his law to the people. We talked some about God reigning through the kings of Israel and how that's such a significant part of the story. And that really gets us through most of the Old Testament, at least the story part of it. Obviously, you've got all of the prophets who served during these kings, and you've got the exile. We'll come to all that in the coming weeks. But we come to a point now where we have to stop, because this part of the story doesn't advance the story. It's a pause in the story, as I said a minute ago, to admire the beauty. We've come to the wisdom literature, and wisdom literature is not a part of the narrative books that advance God's story, which is what we're doing in this class. We're walking through the whole story of Scripture. These don't do that. They don't advance the story, but they are beautiful, and they disclose who God is. So, as I've said every week, just a reminder, we're using, or at least I'm using, The God Who Was There by D.A. Carson as a guide for my study of this and how he breaks this down through all of Scripture. And so this week, as I said, we come to this God who is unfathomably wise. If we were in person, I would ask this question. I'd say, okay, I want you to look through the wisdom literature and tell me what your favorite part is. Maybe your favorite book of the wisdom literature, your favorite psalm, your favorite proverb. Is it Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon? Which one is it and why? And that'd be a fun conversation. What I want to do for just a minute is walk you through each of the books of the wisdom literature. Just give you a brief overview, and then I want to focus on one psalm for just a minute. So let's start with the Psalms. Now, technically, this isn't always wisdom literature in the classic sense, but it often is, and it fits the category here. So the Psalms were, at least in part, an inspired songbook that were used in Solomon's temple and the rebuilt temple. And so imagine when God's people gathered on a feast day or on any time that they worshiped or Sabbath, they would use the Psalms as their songbook, as an inspired songbook. Now, this was written over probably a time period of 1,000 years. Who wrote it? Well, you've got several different authors. You've got David, Moses, and several others. So several different authors of these poems. And obviously, if you've grown up in church, the Psalms are helpful when life is difficult, when life is good, when we've sinned. In fact, in 2018, the whole year we spent Sunday mornings, I spent preaching through the Psalms. And so, obviously, there's a bunch of different Psalms that we could talk about as being very rich and helpful. But this is one of the places that we stop and look at the God and see his beauty and see his unfathomable wisdom. The next of the wisdom literature books that show us how wise God is the Proverbs. Quick summary of the Proverbs is this. It was designed to equip the reader in practical wisdom, discernment, discipline, and discretion. These maxims emphasize, I didn't have this on the screen, sorry. These maxims emphasize the development of skill in all the details of life so that the beauty and righteousness will replace foolishness and evil as one walks in dependence on God. So over and over again in the Proverbs, you have this contrast between what is good and wise and righteous and what is evil and unwise and foolish. And so it contrasts those in 31 chapters. If you've never done the whole, read one chapter of Proverbs a day for a month, that's a cool way to walk through the Proverbs. And again, if you grew up in church, you find these to be very helpful, and you've looked at the Proverbs many times. The next book of the wisdom literature is Job. It's a little bit different than the other. What is the wisdom in Job? If these are the wisdom books, well, here it is. The wisdom is in this long story that is told in Job. We human beings are not always going to get explanations from God about why things happen, but God is bigger than we are, and sometimes we just have to trust him. This is what Carson says And ultimately, we learn in Job that justice will prevail in the end, even when we are wronged or feel as if we've been wrong. Then there's Ecclesiastes. So in Ecclesiastes, here's the basic message of Ecclesiastes. What's the wisdom in it? According to Carson, it is don't waste your time. You have to live in light of the end. That is wisdom, because we will give an account to this unfathomably wise God. And we could spend a lot of time on each one of these books of wisdom, but I'm just trying to summarize them for you. And then there's Song of Solomon. A Song of Solomon has been often misunderstood because it makes us nervous. Here's what Song of Solomon is about. It is an intimate love poem. It describes the love between two actual people, Solomon and the Shulamite. That's the woman being celebrated in poetic form. Now, I don't want to analyze this too deeply. Here's the thing. Love poems are meant to be enjoyed, not analyzed. But because we sometimes dig in and try to analyze, people have done some weird things with Song of Solomon. Some people have taken Song of Solomon and said it's just an allegory. It's just a parable of God's love for Israel and Christ's love for the church. That sounds nice until you read some of the language that is, frankly, overtly sexual. And that kind of blows that up a little bit. Some people view it as a type. It's literal, yes, but has a greater spiritual meaning that points to our relationship with God. Some people have seen it as a drama or a play in which Solomon is rejected by the maiden. I think the best option for interpreting Song of Solomon is to say that this is literal. It describes the love of two actual people, Solomon the Shulamite being celebrated in poetic form. It's the most probable way we can interpret the Song of Solomon. So, I mean, you're talking about, we just looked through 4 or 5 books of the Old Testament that are long and are rich, and we could spend months on each one, and I've just summarized them in 5 minutes. Obviously, that's not ideal, but you get to this part of the story, and you're seeing this God who is wise. Now, what I want to do with this, we could talk a lot about what all these wisdom books do for us, but I want to focus in on just one psalm. So turn to Psalm 1. All right, I want to talk about the wisdom of Psalm 1. So I want you to stop the video, read Psalm 1, and read it with this in mind. What wisdom do you find in Psalm 1? All right, I'll stop the video for a second. Okay, hopefully you've just read Psalm 1. What wisdom do you find there? I think the big thing you see is this wisdom versus foolishness, or the righteous versus the wicked, and the differences between the two, and the folly of following the foolish or wicked way versus the wisdom of following the wisdom of God, and the way of the righteous. And wisdom literature does this often. It contrasts these two different ways that you could go. And you see that especially in Psalm 1. And again, you've read it already. Just to give you an idea of how this contrast occurs. So the righteous, well, they delight in and meditate on the law, and they'll be blessed. The wicked, however, associates with evil. It continues in verse 3. The righteous are like a tree planted by the water. They're fruitful. They're unwithered. They prosper. The wicked, on the other hand, is like the chaff that the wind drives away. Verse 4. And then he talks about the wicked again, that they will not stand in judgment. Verse 5, therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. The other side is the righteous. The Lord knows the way of the righteous. So that gives you an idea, a little more detail at least, of this contrast between the righteous and the wicked. And then the way of the wicked will perish, verse 6. So you bring all of this together and you say, okay, what do you get from this? Well, for those who avoid evil and focus on the word, as you look at verses 1 and 2, well, there is blessing and prospering to be found for that person. So this is another thing the wisdom literature does. It shows us how to find the blessing of God and how to prosper in practical ways. And even when we don't prosper practically, maybe we're not as wealthy as we should be, or want to be, rather, what it looks like to continue following God. And he shows the ultimate end of the wicked. And I think really all of wisdom literature reminds us of this. The good life is found in God's way. Even if it doesn't bring us physical blessing or physical wealth, the ultimate good life is found in God's way. And so the wisdom of Psalm 1 is obvious in its description of this contrast. Jesus taught similarly, didn't he? That'd be a fun conversation, but I think especially in Matthew chapter 7 when he contrasts the wise man and the foolish man. The wise man who built his house on the rock, the foolish man who built his house on the sand. And so you find that in the teachings of Jesus as well. And here's what wisdom literature does just over and over again. It clarifies the polarity, right? So the opposite poles, if you will, between righteousness and unrighteousness, and lets us see in really practical terms what happens when someone follows the path of righteousness versus what happens to the person who follows the path of unrighteousness. So that brings us to the point in the story where we can at least begin talking about how Jesus, very specifically how Jesus is going to come into the story. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.